In the name of God, we want to continue the previous session subject. Genetic relatedness through common descent is not the only way that two occurrences of a phenomenon are not independent. A real contact can result in borrowing of the resemblance, a phenomenon that can be illustrated by structural resemblances found in languages of Balkans. Okay, I want to repeat it again. Genetic relatedness through common descent is not the only way that two occurrences of a phenomenon are not independent. A real contact can result in borrowing of the resemblance. Their contact results in resemblance, not their genetic relatedness. A phenomenon that can be illustrated by structural resemblances found in languages of Balkans. Languages in this area include, here we will read about the languages of Balkan. Languages in this area include Bulgarian, Romanian, and Albanian, which are all Indo-European languages, but from different branches of Indo-European. It means that they are not related in genetic. These languages have developed certain structural features which are not characteristic of their parent languages or of their sister languages outside the Balkan area. Okay, here the resemblance of these three languages is because of the language contact. They borrow that resemblance from each other. It is not genetically. For example, these languages have, for the most part, scout the use of infinitival verbal forms for complements. This is the resemblance between them. Any infinitive present in the parent language is being lost. Therefore, it is not genetically. It is because of their contact and borrowing that from each other. In addition, these languages have also developed a pattern of an enclitic or suffix definite article. One would not want to propose a typological connection between these two features on the evidence of these three languages alone, because these two developments are probably strictly the same phenomenon resulting from the contact situation in the Balkan area. Okay, one would not want to propose a typological connection between these two features on the evidence of these three languages alone, because these two developments are probably historically the same phenomena resulting from a contact situation in Balkan area, dear student, not because of the genetic, it is because of the contact situation, this resemblance. Thus, it only represents one instance of the correlation of absence of the infinitive and post definite article. The general view is that wide geographical and genetic distribution will provide a reasonable guarantee for independence of cases. These two factors, wide geographical and genetic distribution, will provide a reasonable guarantee for independence of cases. Dear student, you should know these reasons. I am just forced to read the booklet line by line and explain them based on this line. You should know this factor. Hence, most probability samples in typology are stratified probability samples, stratified by genetic and or geographical properties. They will stratify by these factors, genetic and geographical properties. However, wide areal and genetic distribution is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for historical independence. Okay, from now we read two factors for historical independence: areal and genetic distribution. Here we read that these two factors are not sufficient condition for historical independence. Here we want to read other factors. First, two phenomena in genetically closely related languages, even if they use cognate forms, may be historically independent. Consider the use of the reflexive morpheme as a middle voice marker of verbs of certain semantic classes and as a marker of genetic passives and other construction types in Spanish and Russian. These two instances appear to be historically independent. The Slavic development was largely completed by the time the Romance development began. And the two language groups were not in contact at the time of Romance development. Thus, we may consider the Spanish and Russian instances of the reflexive as a middle voice marker to be independent occurrences of the phenomenon, even though both languages are Indo-European and are located in Europe, and even though the morphemes in question, which in Spanish is so, in Russian is sia, are cognate. Okay, here you saw one example of this difference. You should know the factor and details about factor for your final exam. Conversely, but for your summarization task, there isn't a need to give more example, just the factors are enough. Conversely, genetic and geographical distance may not be a guarantee of historical independence. Okay, here we want to another matters and its example. Genetic and geographic distance may not be a guarantee of historical independence. Fola is in the Atlantic group of Niger-Congo, branch of Niger Kordofanian, found in the northwest west portion of sub-Saharan Africa. Kinyarwanda is a Bantu language, a 10th-degree subgroup of the Central Niger-Congo branch, and thus genetically quite distant from Fola, and is found in East Africa in the area of Rwanda. Here we read that these two languages are genetically independent from each other. It is here, dear student, we will read the example for this matter, that the genetic and geographical distance may not be a guarantee of historical independence. Okay, we saw that these two languages, Fulwa, are different from Kinyarwanda. It is quite plausible that both Fola and Kinyarwanda could be found in an evenly distributed sample of about 100 languages. The basic word order of both Fola and Kinyarwanda is SVO. SVO means subject, means their sentence order is in this way. S stands for subject, V stands for verb, and O stands for object. It means that in this language, these two languages, the common order is in this way. The subject comes first, then the verb, and then the object, like English, dear student. And we call it SVO, subject, verb, object order. It's quite possible that the SVO word order of these two languages is a common retention from Puerto Niger Congo. The vast majority of all Niger Congo languages are SVO, subject, verb, object, and the few Niger Congo SOV, subject, object, verb, like Persian languages that are found occur sporadically across the whole group. Hence, 100 language sample for the purposes of examining the word order of subject, verb, object may quite likely be dealing with historically the sample phenomenon in the vast majority of Niger Congo languages. This problem varies depending on the degree of stability of the phenomenon in question. Of course, highly unstable phenomena are much less likely to turn out to be common retention from the parent language. But for more stable phenomena, historical independence of cases can be quite a serious problem. Dreyer in 1989 suggests that there are very large areas of linguistic diffusion. It means that in this book we have more than one source and one article or book from Dreyer which belong to this year, and we differentiate them from each other by this letter. Okay, in Dreyer in 1989 suggests that there are very large areas of linguistic diffusion, such as Eurasia, Africa, and North America, at least for word order phenomena. A second problem with probability samples is identifying the proportion of languages to select from different linguistic families and areas. Okay. A second problem with probability samples is identifying the proportion of languages to select from different linguistic families and areas. Bell merely suggests that in a stratified sample, the number in each category is proportional to the size of the category or may be determined by other criteria. One approach is to obtain a proportional distribution for each geographic and or genetic group, for example, ensuring that the proportion of Indo-European languages in the sample is equal to the proportion of Indo-European languages in the world. In order to determine the proper distribution of languages in the sample, we have to know the distribution of languages in the world. Okay, in order to determine the proper distribution of languages in the sample, we have to know the distribution of languages in the world. How many are Indo-European? How many are Austronesian? And so on. But we don't know the distribution of languages because the definition of a language is itself problematic. How do we know that the Swabian dialect of German is just a dialect of German and so should not be counted in the total number of Germanic and Indo-European languages? But that the 5 varieties Bayerbo, Baki, Mary, Bayeria, and Lo on the small island of Ipi in Vanuatu, totaling together altogether 1,640 speakers, are all distinct languages. and should be included in the count of Austronesian? The answer is we don't and probably never will, since the definition of language as opposed to dialect involves non-linguistic as well as linguistic factors. Dreyer in 1989 develops a sampling method that deals with this problem and the independence problem, which he applies to word order studies. Dreyer stratifies the genetic grouping of languages at the level of a genus. Okay, Dreyer stratifies the genetic grouping of languages at the level of a genus, like a level equivalent to a major branch of Indo-European. Instead of sampling a single language from its genus, he pulls together all the languages in the genus. If, for example, they are all SOV, subject, object, verb, then the data point from the genus is counted as SOV. If some languages are SVO, then there are two data points from the genus, an instance of SOV and an instance from SVO. We have both of them based off the genus. Okay, here Dreyer stratified the genetic grouper of languages at the level of genus, like a level equivalent to a major branch of Indo-European. It means that a level of equivalent to a major branch of Indo-European. Okay, if some languages are SVO, then there are two data points from the genus, an instance of SOV and an instance of SVO. Dreyer also proposes 6 continent-sized linguistic areas. Okay, he proposes 6 continent-sized linguistic areas: Africa, Eurasia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, Australia, Papua New Guinea, North America, and South America. He considered this 6 continent linguistic size area and pulls the genus data in the same way as described in the preceding paragraph. Thus, Dreyer assumes only 6 independent cases, or more precisely 12, since he always separates verb-object from the object-verb cases in each other. Dreyer's method allows one to take into consideration all of the data at hand and attempts to minimize the problem of independence of cases. However, it has certain difficulties. One problem pertains to the relationship between genetic and geographic factors in language change. One problem pertains to the relationship between genetic and geographic factors in language change. Dreyer's method essentially assumes that genetic factors are more important in shallower time depths and geographical factors at deeper time depths. But genetic versus geographic factors probably vary depending on the grammatical phenomenon being studied. A stable phenomenon resists change, presumably either internal change or external change. A stable phenomena will survive in genetic families, and hence genetic stratification will be more critical even at greater time depths. Unstable phenomena may change for either internal reasons or through diffusion. Hence, geographic stratification may also be important. An understanding of the genetic and geographic distribution of a grammatical phenomenon is necessary in order to develop the best stratification of a probability sample for statistical purposes. This is essentially what Perkins argued for Perkins describes statistical tests for determining independence of cases and suggests that samples on the order of 100 languages and possibly as few as 40 or 50 are reasonable. In order to use such a method, one must construct a large sample and then draw a subset of reasonably independent cases from the large sample. Dreyer uses genera instead of individual languages because of the apparent bias caused by large but historically shallow genetic groups such as Bantu and Ashanti, each of which consists of hundreds of languages but constitute only one genus. Okay, I want to repeat it again. Dreyer uses genera instead of individual languages because of the apparent bias caused by large but historically shallow genetic groups such as Bantu and Oceanic, each of which consists of hundreds of languages but constitutes only one genus. This is an external historical accident. Dreyer's pooling technique essentially brings the sample back to the linguistic state of the world at about 1000 BC, the approximate time depth of a genus, since if a whole genus is SOV, then the proto-language is likely to have been SOV. Okay, since if a whole genus is SOV, then the proto-language is likely to have been SOV. For example, Dreyer suggests that there were more SOV languages than now because the recently expanded Bantu and Ashanti families are largely SVO. Bantu and Ashanti constitute about 10% of the languages of the world, mean 500 or 600 languages each, yet they make up only 0.4% of the genera. But the linguistic situation circa 1000 BC was itself biased by whatever large families existed then. Moreover, the sample of language families that have survived since then, the only sample we can construct, is further biased by the external historical accident of the extinction of other languages that existed in 1000 BC, such as those that have been replaced by the Bantu Oceanic languages. It could be that the languages in 1000 BC that have not survived were SVO, and so the balance of SOV to SVO languages has not really changed significantly since then. However, Dreyer's method treats the 6 language areas independently. The likelihood of the current distribution of a trait such as SOV, SVO being biased in the same direction in all 6 areas is less than 0.05, which is considered acceptable for statistical purposes. Also, if there were, dear student, the details are not important for your summarization, and for a final exam you should know the original factor. But I read the example to clear the matter. Also, if there were any genera in 1000 BC with large numbers of languages, the numbers of their languages have been pared down by history. Genera at 1000 BC would presumably go back to 4000 before Christ, the level sometimes called a stock. but no extant stock has anywhere close to as many genera as the Bantu and Oceanic genera have languages. Moreover, the large number of languages in the Bantu and Oceanic and certain other genera is probably unique to recent human history. Language density is inversely proportional to ecological risk to the speech community. Ecological risk is lowest in the tropical areas nearest the equator, where Bantu and Oceanic expanded, but the low ecological risk in the tropics has existed as such only since the end of the last ice age. Also, the expansions of Bantu, Oceanic, and certain other large genera probably accompanied the expansion of agriculture, again only a recent development in human history. Nevertheless, the recent expansion of the Pama Nyungan genus of Australian Aboriginal languages to 172 languages demonstrates that hunter-gatherer bands can expand significantly in an environment of relatively high ecological risk. There still remains a fundamental problem, however. We don't know if the current population of languages has achieved a stationary distribution in the statistical sense, that is, that the current proportion of language types is more or less independent of the random birth and death process of languages. A stationary distribution implies that enough time has passed for a language to have possibly passed through all the relevant types, like for language to shift from SVO to SOV or SVSO, and so on the back again. If that much time has not passed, the distribution of relevant language types may reflect the starting distribution plus some additional changes, without having settled into the neutral probability distribution of types. Maslova argues that we are not certain that the current situation is a stationary distribution relative to the historical accident of whatever types the first modern human language or languages were. Dreyer in 2000 suggests that the current situation is probably not even a stationary distribution relative to major demographic events such as the expansion into Oceania. As with variety samples, however, we must not lose sight of the goal of probability samples, which is to discover theoretically significant relations between grammatical traits. If the current state of the world's languages is not a stationary distribution, then one cannot rely solely on probability samples to ascertain relationship between grammatical traits. These relations can be observed directly in the process of language change, either through direct documentation where available or through comparative studies. For example, if trait A, say relative order of genitive and noun, is correlated with trait B, relative order of object and verb, then a language that changes to type B should also relatively soon change to type A. These changes are what Maslova described as transition probabilities for the different structure types that a language may belong to. Okay, Maslova called these changes as a transition probability for the different structure types that the language may belong to. Dear student, this bold terms and word are important. You should know their definition and explanation. In fact, Bill writes, I think that a case can be made that such research on language universals can properly be conceived as sampling language changes, not languages themselves. Okay, Maslova has recently proposed a method for approximating the transition probabilities of a two-way typological classification transitions from type A to type B and vice versa by constructing the probability samples of pairs of closely related languages and comparing the proportion of pairs which are both type A and both type B and split between A and B. This method can be extended to more complex typological classifications. This is one reason why typological research has shifted its attention toward diachronic typology. In fact, examination of the distribution of language types in genetic units of similar and different type steps and in geographic areas of varying size and topography will often be as enlightening about the grammatical relationship among types as a carefully crafted probability samples. Okay, we want to read about the data sources, which is very important matter in typology. About the data sources, finally, there remains the problem of the quality of the actual data used in typological research. Okay, here the problem of the quality of the actual data used in typological research remains. This is an extremely important issue since no one typologist can achieve the level of knowledge of all of the languages in his or her sample that the specialist in each language, let alone a linguistically trained native speaker, has. For this reason, the typologist, dear student, this is important. For this reason, because the languages are vast and we cannot collect all of them. We have limitation to collect all of the languages to study them. For this reason, the typologist has to rely on a variety of data sources. The data sources used by typologists are native speaker elicitation, text, and descriptive grammars. This is very important. You should know the data sources: native speaker elicitation, text, and descriptive grammars. You should mention these data sources which the typologists use in your summarization, and you should know that for your final exam. Okay, dear student, because of this limitation, we have 3 data sources in typology, which is native speaker elicitation, text, and descriptive grammar. This is important, and we will read about all of them in details. Reliance on native speakers, which is one of the sources, native speaker elicitation. Reliance on the native speakers is unfortunately impractical if a large and diverse sample is desired. Okay. Reliance on native speaker is unfortunately impractical if a large and diverse sample is desired. It also has its difficulties. The process of eliciting grammatical information is not a natural language situation, and so the data provided don't always accurately represent actual language use. In particular, the native language consultant doesn't report actual usage, but instead on systematic perception of usage colored by social attitudes toward the speech form and even toward the interrogator, a desire to give the interrogator an agreeable answer, Also, the linguist elicits information selectively, and crucial information that is relevant to the phenomenon may not be elicited precisely because it doesn't fit the linguist's prior expectations. As Kammer puts it, elicitation techniques and the elicitation situation impose a number of intermediary stages between the structure of a language and the elicitor's perception of it. A method developed more recently to avoid the problem of the impracticality of interviewing informants from dozens, if not hundreds, of languages is not construct a questionnaire to elicit relevant data and distribute the questionnaire to native consultants and to field specialists who are willing to fill it out. However, designing questionnaires to elicit accurate information is extremely difficult, as any sociologist will attest. Questionnaires are essentially like elicitation, but as a further remove. Hence, they suffer from the same difficulties as elicitation, but to a higher degree, and are therefore unreliable. Another relatively direct form of data that can be used for typological analysis is textual data. Another relatively direct form of data that can be used for typological analysis is textual data. This has the advantage of being data of actual language, unfiltered by artificial elicitation situation or by informant's self-perception. Also, texts provide quantitative data which play an important role in typological analysis. However, even textual data have their difficulties. Most texts are narratives, sometimes literary or sacred in origin, and there are very few available texts of face-to-face spoken conversation. It may be difficult, if not impossible, to find the relevant data in a given set of texts if the phenomenon is rare. Finally, the proper interpretation may not be adequately captured by the morpheme gloss and free translation. Consultation of an informant for the interpretation is often necessary but often impossible, even though it is not always possible to reconstruct the intended meaning without the original context. This leads descriptive grammars written by native speakers or field workers. The descriptive grammars have one great advantage over the data sources discussed above. They present a relatively comprehensive description of the grammatical system without the bias of the researcher that may score elicitation techniques for a specific grammatical phenomenon. Descriptive grammars vary in their comprehensiveness, of course, and their lack of detail poses a problem for typologists, particularly if some relatively esoteric phenomenon is being examined. There are also the potential biases of the author of the grammar, whether a native speaker with respect to language attitudes or a linguist with respect to length of exposure to the language and theoretical orientation. Grammars supplemented with text can go some way to providing a check on author bias. Finally, the descriptive grammar's comprehensiveness is of value only if the typologist uses it. As Greenberg once said in a class lecture, you gotta muck around in grammars. You can't just pick a fact out from the grammar. Descriptive grammars are certainly superior to the use of secondary sources in which data from primary sources is gathered together. The selection and interpretation of the data in secondary sources is often biased by the hypothesis of the analyst, whose knowledge of the languages is at best indirect. Secondary sources must always be confirmed by the primary sources they cite. These considerations, pro and con, on the sources of linguistic data apply to all linguistic analysis, not just typological analysis. They have particular importance for the typologists because the typologist must handle a large amount of data for a large number of languages, for most of which he or she must rely on the indirect knowledge. No source of data, native consultants, actual text, or descriptive grammars is perfect, but any and all sources can provide relevant data when used judiciously. Okay, dear student, we arrived at the second chapter of this book, which is the typological classification. In the first chapter, we told you the basic matters of typology. We define it and we explain about its parts in details. Now in this chapter, we will read about the way of classifying the typology. I read about one or two paragraphs of this chapter. The typological classification is the process of describing the various linguistic types found across languages for some grammatical parameters such as grammatical number or the formation of relative clauses. Okay, you should know the definition of typological classification. By typological classification, we mean the process of describing the various linguistic types found across languages for some grammatical parameters, such as grammatical number or the formation of relative clauses. This is the definition of typological classification. You should know that. Typological classification is historically the first manifestation of typology in modern linguistics, starting with the morphological classification of languages in the 19th century. Okay, at first, the typological classification in the 19th century was in terms of morphological classification. You should know that. The notion of a linguistic type has changed somewhat since that time, particularly under the impact of the structural linguistics. The term typology was first used in the linguistics in 1901. The following section will describe the current concept of a linguistic type or a strategy, as it is sometimes called, while the concluding section will discuss morphological typology and the major conceptual changes that have occurred in the evolution of the concept of linguistic type. The usual procedure for initiating a cross-linguistic comparison of a particular grammatical phenomenon for the purposes of a typological analysis is to survey the range of structures used for the phenomena in question. In morphosyntax, the phenomenon is generally a grammatical construction defined on an external basis, precisely because of the degree of structural variation actually found in the languages. Thus, given a particular external definition of a category, such as that proposed for the relative clause, one may then classify the linguistic structures found across languages to express or manifest that external definition. These structures are called types or strategies. You should know that. I told you that these both terms are important. Given a particular external definition of category, such as that proposed for the relative class, one may then classify the linguistic structures found across languages to express or manifest that external definition. These structures are called types or strategies. This is typology in the first sense across linguistic structural classification of morphosyntactic phenomena. Okay, so it is enough until a cross-linguistically valid description of morphosyntactic structure. Please read and look at this video many times to get the point and summarize it and learn that for the final.